What if I told you there's a way to grow food that never runs out? A system where fish, plants, and water work together so perfectly that once it starts, it almost runs itself. No constant buying, no endless inputs, just a loop that keeps producing year after year. And the craziest part? This isn't new technology. It's something humanity figured out thousands of years ago, and then somehow forgot. It begins in a backyard that looks completely ordinary. No massive farm, no advanced technology. Just a quiet patch of land in North Carolina, 1984. A biologist walks outside, shovel in hand, and starts digging. Not for a garden, not for a swimming pool, just a hole. There's something almost strange about it, because nothing about this moment looks like the beginning of a breakthrough. He lines the hole with clay, fills it with water, adds fish. Then, above that water, he places a simple bed where plants can grow. No soil, no fertilizer, just roots sitting where water can reach them. At first, nothing seems different. But then, the system starts to move. The fish eat, they grow, and like any living thing, they produce waste. In a normal setup, that waste would be a problem. It would build up, poison the water, force constant cleaning, constant intervention. But here, something else is happening. That waste doesn't stay waste. It becomes nutrients. Invisible colonies of bacteria begin to form along every surface touched by water. They take what would normally be toxic and transform it. Slowly, quietly, they convert it into a form that plants can use. And the plants respond. Their roots stretch into that water, pulling out exactly what they need. As they grow, they clean the water at the same time, removing what would otherwise harm the fish. And just like that, the loop is complete. The water returns clean. The fish keep living. The plants keep growing. Nothing added, nothing wasted. It's the kind of system that feels almost too perfect, like something that shouldn't work in the real world. But it does. And the moment you realize that, a bigger question starts to form. Because if something this simple works this well, why isn't everyone doing it? The answer isn't in that backyard. It's in history. Because this wasn't an invention. It was a rediscovery. Long before this experiment, entire civilizations were already using systems like this. Not as experiments, not as alternatives, but as their primary way of producing food. And they didn't just survive with it, they thrived. Which means what you're looking at here isn't just a clever setup, it's a forgotten pattern. One that worked so well, it became invisible. Until someone decided to bring it back. If you want to understand how powerful this system really is, you have to go back long before modern science, before electricity, before industrial farming ever existed. You have to go back to a time when entire cities depended on natural cycles just to survive. One of the clearest examples comes from the Aztec civilization. In the heart of what is now Mexico City, there was a vast lake system. But instead of fighting the water, the Aztecs built on top of it. They created floating islands called chinampas. At first glance, they looked like simple farmland. But they were far more advanced than anything most people realize. Between these islands, water flowed constantly. And in that water lived fish. Not controlled in cages, not fed artificial diets. They lived naturally, feeding on algae, insects, and whatever the ecosystem provided. And here's where it gets interesting. Nothing was wasted. The fish produced waste, and that waste didn't pollute the system. It fed the plants growing above them. Those plants, in turn, filtered and cleaned the water, sending it back through the system again. A closed loop. Self-sustaining, constantly productive. And the results were extraordinary. This system helped feed a city of over 200,000 people at a time when most parts of the world were still struggling with basic agricultural output. No synthetic fertilizer, no modern machinery, no industrial supply chains. Just balance. But when outsiders encountered this system, they didn't see it as genius. They saw something unfamiliar, something that didn't match their understanding of how agriculture should look. So instead of preserving it, they replaced it. Straight-line farming took over. Fields replaced floating ecosystems. Dependency replaced balance. And something similar happened across the world. In China, during ancient dynasties, farmers developed another version of the same idea. Fish ponds were integrated with crops and trees. Mulberry trees fed silkworms. Silkworm waste fed fish. Fish waste fertilized the environment. Everything looped back into itself. Again, no waste, no external dependency, just circulation. For centuries, these systems worked quietly in the background of human civilization. And then, something changed. The industrial era arrived.
Suddenly, efficiency was measured in speed, not balance. It became easier to buy fertilizer than to understand nutrient cycles. Easier to separate animals from crops than to integrate them. Easier to control nature than to cooperate with it. And slowly, these loop systems disappeared. Not because they failed, but because they didn't fit the new model. A model built on constant consumption. And that's how one of the most efficient food systems ever created became almost forgotten. Until it was rediscovered again. Not in a palace, not in a lab, but in a simple backyard experiment. And what that experiment proved would challenge everything we think we know about growing food. The real breakthrough didn't come from inventing something new. It came from realizing that nothing was missing in the first place. Because when scientists began studying these systems more closely, they discovered something important. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. It wasn't just ancient agriculture. It was a fully functioning biological loop. And it only needed 3 things to exist: fish, bacteria, and plants. But in this system, that waste is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. Because the second component is already working silently in the background. Bacteria. Not visible, not controlled, but absolutely essential. These microorganisms colonize every wet surface in the system. The tank walls, the pipes, the grow beds. And their job is simple but powerful. They transform waste. First, they convert toxic ammonia into nitrites. Then, they convert nitrites into nitrates. And nitrates are not waste at all. They are plant food. That's where the third component comes in: the plants. Their roots are constantly exposed to this nutrient-rich water. Instead of searching through soil, they are directly connected to everything they need: nitrogen, minerals, nutrients created by the fish and processed by bacteria. As they grow, they pull those nutrients out of the water, and in doing so, they clean it. By the time the water returns to the fish, it's safe again, and the loop continues. Fish feed bacteria. Bacteria feed plants. Plants clean water for fish. Over and over again. No endpoint, no waste stream, no external disposal. Just circulation. And when researchers measured this system in real-world conditions, the results were hard to ignore. Some setups were using up to 90% less water than traditional farming, because water wasn't being lost. It wasn't running off into soil or evaporating in large quantities. It was staying inside the system, continuously cycling. Even more surprising was productivity. Small backyard systems, sometimes no larger than a parking space, were producing both vegetables and fish at the same time. Not as a side benefit, because as the bacterial colony matured, the system became more stable. The balance between fish, bacteria, and plants became more efficient.
Output increased without increasing input. At that point, the system stops feeling like farming and starts feeling like infrastructure. Something designed not to be controlled every day, but to run in the background of life. And that changes the role of the person building it. You're no longer constantly fixing problems. You're maintaining balance, feeding fish, watching plants grow, letting biology do what it has always done, when given the right conditions. But understanding how it works is only the first step, because knowing the loop exists is very different from building it yourself. And that's where the real shift begins.
Building a system like this doesn't start with complexity. It starts with space. Not a farm, not acres of land. Just a small, controlled area where water can move, plants can grow, and fish can live in balance. A backyard, a greenhouse, even a simple corner that gets consistent light and access to electricity. Because this system isn't about size, it's about connection. At the center of everything is a fish tank. This is where the cycle begins in real time. The fish eat, they grow, and they produce waste that carries the entire system forward. Next to it is the grow bed. This is where plants live, but there is no soil here. Instead, there is a neutral medium that simply holds roots in place while water flows around them. The plants are not searching for nutrients. The nutrients are delivered directly to them. And connecting the two is the simplest part of all. A pump. That pump moves water from the fish tank into the grow bed. It floods the plant roots with nutrient-rich water. Then gravity brings it back down again. And just like that, the loop begins. But here's where most people fail before they even start. They rush. They add fish too early, before the system is ready, before the invisible foundation has formed. And when that happens, the balance collapses. Because what you can't see is the most important part. Before fish can thrive, bacteria must exist. So the system has to be cycled first. Water moves through the setup. A small source of ammonia is introduced. And then nothing happens. At least nothing visible. But underneath the surface, everything is changing. Bacteria begin to colonize every wet surface. Slowly, quietly, building a biological network that will eventually control the entire system. At first, ammonia rises. Then it drops. Nitrites appear, then disappear. And finally, nitrates begin to stabilize. That moment is critical, because it means the loop is alive. Only then do fish enter the system. Carefully, gradually. Not as an overload, but as a controlled start. And once they are in, everything begins to accelerate. Plants respond first. Growth becomes faster. Leaves become richer. Colors deepen. The system starts showing visible signs that something is working underneath the surface. Then, fish growth follows. And over time, the system reaches a point where it no longer feels experimental. It becomes predictable. By the first few months, you begin harvesting greens regularly. Lettuce, basil, mint, kale. Things that normally take time in soil now grow faster, cleaner, and more consistently. Then, the fish begin reaching harvest size. And suddenly, you are no longer just growing plants. You are producing protein and vegetables from the same system. At that point, something shifts psychologically, because you're no longer asking if it works. You're watching it work, and that changes how you interact with it. You stop trying to control every detail. You start observing balance instead. Feeding fish, checking water, harvesting plants. Small actions that maintain a living system that now feels stable on its own. And as the months pass, the system doesn't slow down. It stabilizes. It matures. It becomes something you can rely on. And once that happens,
the output begins to exceed expectation. More food than needed, more growth than anticipated, more consistency than traditional methods can offer in the same space. At that point, it stops being just about self-sufficiency and starts becoming something much larger. A shift in how food itself is understood. Because now you're not dependent on a supply chain. You're operating inside a loop that produces its own supply. And that realization is where everything starts to change.
At a certain point, something unexpected happens. The system stops feeling like something you built and starts feeling like something you're part of. Because it doesn't demand constant attention anymore. It doesn't break every time conditions change slightly. It doesn't rely on external inputs to keep functioning. It simply continues. Fish continue to eat and grow. Bacteria continue to process waste into nutrients. Plants continue to turn that nutrients into food while cleaning the water at the same time. The loop doesn't pause. It doesn't need permission. And that's where its real strength becomes obvious. Because in a world where almost everything depends on something else, money, supply chains, fuel, transportation, chemicals, this system depends on almost nothing once it's stable. Just balance and consistency. You begin to notice changes that go beyond food production. You stop thinking in terms of buying food as your only option. You start thinking in terms of producing it. You begin to understand where nutrients come from, how ecosystems maintain themselves, and why waste is never really waste in a functioning cycle. What once felt complicated becomes intuitive, and slowly, your relationship with food changes completely. But the most powerful shift isn't technical, it's psychological. Because you are no longer fully dependent on systems you cannot see or control. You are no longer waiting on deliveries, prices, shortages, or external decisions to determine what you eat. You are participating directly in production. And that creates something most people rarely experience: stability. Not the kind that comes from money or storage, but the kind that comes from understanding a system well enough to trust it. And as time passes, that trust becomes routine. You feed the fish, you check the water, you harvest what grows, and everything continues as expected. Season after season, year after year, the loop remains closed. And while the outside world deals with rising costs, supply disruptions, and uncertainty, your system continues quietly in the background. Not because it's advanced. Because it's aligned with how nature already works. Because in nature, nothing is wasted. Everything becomes something else. And that is exactly what this system recreates. A closed loop where every input returns as output. Where every waste becomes fuel. Where every cycle strengthens the next one. And once you understand that, the idea of food stops being about control and starts being about cooperation. You're not forcing production anymore. You're arranging conditions where production happens naturally. The fish do what fish have always done. The bacteria do what bacteria have always done. The plants do what plants have always done. And your role is simple. You bring them together and let the loop run. Because in the end, this isn't just a farming method. It's a reminder that the most efficient systems in the world were never designed by force. They were discovered by observation. And the closer we align with those systems, the less we need to fight against them. So the question isn't whether this works. It already does. The question is whether you're ready to build something that keeps working, even when everything else doesn't.